Welcome to Deschutes Public Library's online programming. I'm Liz Goodrich, part of the Community Relations team, and you are here today for a presentation by Professor James Stanley Harrison on a brief survey of history of Blacks in Oregon. Professor Harrison is a retired instructor of history and humanities on the Cascade campus of Portland Community College in North Portland. He has been on the PCC faculty since 1983. And during his tenure, he received the Excellence in Teaching Award and was admitted to the prestigious Great Teachers Institute. He taught a wide range of courses, including History of Africa, History of Religion in the U.S., and History of Mexico. He holds graduate degrees in history from Hunter College, Curriculum and Educational Administration from Gonzaga University, and Pastoral Ministry from the University of Portland. He presents and publishes regularly about the intersection of racism and history. Please welcome Professor James Harrison.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And so let me begin with saying that an understanding of Black history is important for a fuller understanding of the history of Oregon itself. And we need to be cognizant that the fact that Oregon history is intertwined with the history of the US, and it's also influenced by things happening around the globe. The aim of this presentation is to expand your knowledge of the significance of Blacks in Oregon history, but please remember this is just a very, very brief look at the history of Blacks in Oregon, and especially what Black people have done in order to expand the meaning of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the US to make Oregon a more livable place for all people. Let me begin by asking you to ponder this. And at this point, you might want to pause for a short while, but what do you know about the history of Blacks in Oregon, and what would you like to know about that history? So after your pause, I will begin. And again, this is a very sweeping and short history. And I'll have some remarks at the end in terms of how you can learn more about Oregon history. All right, let me begin. Again, a brief history of Blacks in Oregon. We need to start by acknowledging that Oregon was initially Indian country. And on this map, you can see some of the groups that occupied Oregon. This history goes back to about 8,000 BC, which is the earliest inclination that we have of human settlement in Oregon. The history of Oregon does not begin in the 1830s with the advancement of the pioneers. And speaking of the pioneers, this is the beginning of modern Oregon history. You can see the United States at the time of the Louisiana Purchase and the coming of whites to Oregon country, which initially included all of Oregon, some Idaho, some of Montana, British Columbia as well. And eventually the Oregon country was disputed by the British and the Americans, and Northwest Oregon, or excuse me, Northwest Washington was the disputed area between the two countries. It was acknowledged that the US would probably occupy the area below the Columbia River, but the area north of the Columbia River was disputed. One of the first Black people that we know existed in Oregon was York, who came with the Corps of Discovery, that is sometimes called the Lewis and Clark Expedition. And York was a very, very important person in this expedition. As you can see in the illustration, he was one of the major hunters in the expedition. He was also a very gregarious person, And so he was able to make friends very quickly with the Native Americans who were here. York was also a very important person in terms of saving some of the diaries of Lewis and Clark that had fallen into a river. He also was very instrumental in deciding where the Corps of Discovery would winter during 1805, 1806. Even though he was a slave, the slave of Clark, he did get to vote on that. And so he was the first Black person to actually cast a vote of significance in Oregon history. Another very important person was Sir James Douglas. Sir Douglas was the chief factor of Fort Vancouver from 1838 to 1849. He replaced Dr. John McLaughlin, who had taken a vacation and then moved on from Washington to Oregon. Sir James, realizing that if the Americans came, they would bring with them their prejudices and so forth, moved the headquarters of the Hudson's Bay Company to Vancouver Island. And he was the founder, if you will, of Fort Victoria, which later became Victoria. And he was the governor of that area. Later on, when he moved the Hudson's Bay Company to Vancouver, he also became the first governor of British Columbia. Now, this is something that's really very important because we, meaning Oregon, lost a very, very influential and important person, someone who believed that, for example, that there should be no slavery of American Indians in Vancouver, Washington, and he continued that particular philosophy when he moved to Canada. In the 1840s, he also sent word to Blacks in California and San Francisco area to move to BC, where there would not be discriminated against. And so that led to the initial growth of Vancouver. Peter Burnett is a very important person in Oregon history because he was a part of the provisional government of Oregon Territory, and he is the one who wrote the infamous Lash Law, which, as you can see, required that Black people, free or not, leave Oregon so that we become an all-white area. That was the notion of a number of people who came to Oregon because they came from a variety of places. Some came from New England, some from the old Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and some came from Missouri. One of the things they wanted was land, because at that time, owning land was very, very important. And that meant that you could basically establish yourself economically. The other thing they wanted to do was to get away from the big controversy in the US at that time, which was slavery. And so they wanted to avoid the controversy by avoiding Black people. And so the territory and later the state excluded Black people, whether they were slave or free. After a while, Peter Burnett moved from Oregon to California, and he also tried, but was not successful, in imposing an exclusion law in California. Nevertheless, he became the first governor of California, and even though there was no law about Blacks not being there, there was a lot of prejudice against Blacks and later against the Chinese when they arrived in the 1850s. The Oregon Trail from the 1830s to the 1860s brought tens of thousands of people from several jumping off places in Missouri, St. Joe, St. Louis, and so forth. And they really had a brutal time getting across the Oregon Trail. But what a lot of people don't realize is that despite the fact that slavery and free blacks were excluded, they did come along the Oregon Trail. Mary Jane Holmes Shipley Drake was one of those who came. She was the slave of a wagon trail master. And when they arrived in Oregon, her father sued in order to free her because slavery was not allowed in Oregon. And it took about 15 months for the suit to go through various levels of court. And finally, the Supreme Court of Oregon declared that she was to be free. And she was freed. She began a family. And this was one of the beginnings of free blacks in Oregon. Another person who came to Oregon was a free black named Richard Bogle. He was born in Jamaica, moved to New York, and then decided to come to Oregon. At that time, there was a movement, a great movement of people from the East Coast to the West Coast in order to acquire land. And Mr. Bogle came, established himself in Salem, and later married a woman who had come across the trail as a slave, America Bogle. And this is a picture of their family. He was a very successful person. He moved down to California, worked in the gold mines for a while, returned to Oregon, and he learned the barbering trade in California and brought that to Oregon. So he was a very successful businessman. After a while, he decided to move his family to Walla Walla, Washington, and there he opened a barbershop and became one of the founders of a bank in Walla Walla. Like Sir Douglas, he is another example of something that Oregon lost, but only temporarily, because two of his sons later moved back to Oregon. They moved to Portland and started a barbershop. One of their barbershops was in the Golden West Hotel, which was a Black-owned hotel in Portland, Oregon. Another person who came across the Oregon Trail was George Washington, who came from Virginia. He was a free man, and he came with a group of whites as well. And they decided, after living in Oregon for, I think, about 1 year, that it would be best if they moved north of the Columbia River, because by then Washington had been cut off and they did not have an exclusion law. Now, why is this man so important? It's because he bought some land, or at least his white friends bought land, and then he acquired that land, and he started a town called Centralville. He platted the town and sold land. That town was later called Centralia, and it's still up there. If you go to Centralia, you will find a number of statues of him, as well as a gigantic mural on the wall of the U.S. National Bank. During the 1880s, when there was a depression in the U.S., George Washington loaned money and also gave food to his people, the residents of Centralia. Another miss for Oregon by having the exclusion law, which was intended, and it did, discourage Blacks from coming to the state of Oregon. On the national level, Dred and Harriet Scott sued for their freedom in 1857 because they had been taken from Missouri to Wisconsin, which was a free state, and they sued for their freedom after having been residents of a free state. This became a very, very important case in the history of the US and also the history of Oregon, because Dred Scott lost his case, and the Supreme Court stated that the US government, and Oregon had a similar statement, had that Blacks had no right, which the white people were responsible for respecting. And so that put a pale over the Black people in Oregon. Very quickly after that, another major event occurred, and that was the Civil War. 180,000 Blacks fought in the Civil War on the northern side, and they were the tipping point, according to President Lincoln, in winning the war. After the Civil War, or during the Civil War, Oregon increased its anti-Black policies by passing a law that Blacks could not own land, they could not testify in court. They also added, and this was not a problem, but it's just an example of their distrust and dislike of Blacks, an anti-miscegenation law that Blacks and Hawaiians and Chinese could not marry whites. The 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War, and this is one of the 3 amendments passed to free Blacks, give Blacks the vote, and so forth. But what it did was to nullify the exclusion laws of Oregon, that Blacks had to be treated equally, could not be denied any rights, even though in actuality that did continue to happen. But this became a linchpin of the civil rights movement in Oregon. McCann Stewart came from the East Coast. He was a lawyer, and he became the first Black lawyer in Oregon, taking all kinds of cases defending Black people, defending white people. And it's significant that there were very few. He was the first, and I believe there's one other Black lawyer in Oregon at the time, because Blacks were not allowed to practice law. They were not allowed to get into the professions such as teaching, and even limited in becoming physicians. The Golden West Hotel, and the building still exists in Portland, was founded by several Black people in order to serve the Blacks who worked on the railroad. The railroad was completed or reached Oregon in the 1880s, and this hotel was in Northwest Portland, in the area just above Chinatown, and that was the first Black community in Portland. The Blacks arrived here, stayed in this area, and so the hotel was built. As I mentioned before, one of the sons of Richard Bogle owned a barbershop in this hotel. Another extremely important person in Oregon history was Beatrice Kennedy Franklin. She came from Texas, and it was a romance that brought her here. She married the editor of The Advocate, and pretty soon she became the associate editor, and actually she became the editor of The Advocate. Mrs. Kennedy, she later remarried a man named Franklin and moved to California, but when she was in Oregon, she was extremely important in terms of publicizing Blacks. Black newspapers specifically printed stories about successful Blacks, but she also printed stories in the Oregonian And she began several things. One, she began speaking tours around the state of Oregon. In fact, one of her tours took her to Bend, Oregon, where she gave a talk to high school students about race relations and so forth. Another activity that she began was to have teas. And these were interracial teas held in her house, sponsoring sometimes about 50 people, 50 women of different ethnicities. And she made sure that people met in groups which were multiracial, feeling that if people got to know each other one-on-one, there would be less fear, less racism. She also was one of the founding members of the first NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, west of the Mississippi. And she was a very, very important person there. One example of what she did, in the 1920s, Vernonia had a small Black population, and the Black children were not allowed to go to school. So she journeyed out there, had to talk with several officials, and then had a running battle with the editor of the Vernonia newspaper about why Blacks should be treated equally. This all based on the 14th Amendment, which stated that people should not be denied because of the color of their skin. After a while, she also ran for state representative as a Republican, and it was a multi-representative district. Even though there were just a few hundred Blacks in Portland in her district, she gathered, I think, something like 500 or 600 votes, many more votes than there were Blacks. And so she had an appeal to both Blacks and whites. Several years after she lost, she left Oregon and joined two of her sons down in California. One of the other things that she did was to oppose the most racist movie that has ever been produced in the US, and that was the movie that sparked the rise of the second Ku Klux Klan. The biggest Ku Klux Klans in the US in the 1920s were not in southern states. They were in Indiana and in Oregon. In Oregon, one of the strongest, meaning more white males enrolled than any other by percentage, was Tillamook, which had very few Blacks. And the Klan in Oregon was not essentially an anti-Black Klan. It was an anti-Catholic Klan and an anti-foreign Klan. But she thought that any type of prejudice was bad for the state of Oregon. And so she wrote and also took cases against it. Did I mention to you that she became the first Black woman lawyer in Oregon? The Birth of a Nation was a very, very popular and historically incorrect story of the beginning of the Ku Klux Klan. And it had scenes that were bound to cause riots. In fact, they did in Los Angeles, Boston, and in New York, because it showed really very seriously bad picture of Blacks in the Civil War period or the post-Civil War period, and how the Klan gloriously saved America. Mrs. Kennedy opposed this film. She wrote against it, and she also went to hearings about it, so that some scenes were literally cut out of the show during the first showing of the Klan. The Klan was shown several other times in the 30s. Even though Blacks were banned from Oregon, and as I said, the 14th Amendment basically ended that, from time to time, businesses would call on Blacks recruit Blacks to come to Oregon for specific works. For example, in the 1890s, Marshville, which is now Coos Bay, they discovered coal in the hills, and so they recruited Blacks from the eastern coal fields to come because they had that particular skill. In the 1920s, logging companies in Maxville in eastern Oregon and Vernonia in western Oregon also recruited Blacks who had a specialty, the specialty of logging. Maxville, for example, was one of the largest towns in Wallowa County in the 1920s. It had about 400 people, and about 10% of them were Black. The town is now gone. It's a ghost town. But it's an indication that when people are needed, they are recruited despite the laws and despite the attitude. They came. They got along pretty well with their white counterparts as well. And it indicated that it is possible for people of different ethnic groups to live together in harmony if they have a common goal. Speaking of common goal, in 1941, the United States became involved in the global conflict, and Henry Kaiser began to recruit people to work in the shipyards, and he basically threw a wide net that would include a lot of Blacks. Vanport is very, very important because this is the beginning of, if you will, the modern changes in Oregon's ethnicity. In 1940, in the census, there were about 1,900 or so Blacks in the city of Portland. By 1944, it's estimated that there were perhaps 22,000 there, but they were limited in where they could stay because of the prejudice of the day. And so Henry Kaiser, or his son actually, built Vanport, which was a housing community that would provide residences for about 40,000 people. Initially, when Blacks came, they made up about 7% of the population. And as the war basically slowed down and ended, whites were able to move out or move back home. Some Blacks moved back home, but half of them, as half of all the shipyard workers, decided to remain in Portland. But the only two places where they could stay in terms of housing projects were, one of them was Vanport, the largest one, and the other was a small project in North Portland. As whites moved out, the population or the percentage of Blacks in Vanport increased until by 1948, when the place flooded, it was about 25% of the population. The photos that you're looking at, on the lower left is a shot of Vanport. On the upper right, Vanport also brought some other changes. As the war was winding down, Japanese Americans were allowed to come back. And since they had no places in Portland, their houses had been sold or confiscated, they moved to Vanport. In addition, American Indians lived in Vanport as well. And as the war was winding down, American soldiers were brought in, and it became kind of a hospital city. But they also started a college, Vanport College, for veterans, and they could use their GI Bill money to do that. And so we have another addition to Portland. I should also say that Vanport, when it existed, was a microcosm of the United States. It had citizens from all 48 states, from Alaska, which was a territory at that time, and from those coming back to the US from Mexico. When the city flooded, the picture on the lower right, the entire population, about 17,800, including about 5,000 Blacks, moved into the city of Portland, and therefore they went from being residents to being voters, and they added to the numbers of Blacks already living in the city of Portland. Dr. Denovo is another really critical person. He came to Oregon in the 1930s to become the Black doctor. He was the doctor to the folks who worked on the railroad, and also all Blacks and many whites in Portland remember Dr. Denovo Unthank. There's a park in Portland named for him today, Unthank Park. Richard Bogle was in the 1970s the first Black broadcaster in the Northwest on television. And he did that job for about a decade before deciding to run for the city council. And he became the second Black person to serve on the city council in Portland after, by the way, a career as a police officer. He was one of the first Black police officers in Portland during the 1950s and 60s. Mr. Bogle is the grandson of Richard Bogle and America Waldo. In the 1960s, Mark Hatfield, Otto and Verdell Rutherford, and others formed the Coalition of Blacks and Whites in order to improve the condition of Blacks living in Oregon. And they were able to pass through the state legislature a series of laws, public accommodation law, for example, that Blacks could live any place they wanted to in the state of Oregon. There were several cities that had banned Oregon or really discouraged Blacks from living there. But this law began to change that. There was still prejudice, but at least now people could be taken to court in order to alleviate the situation. In the 1960s, a group called the Black Panthers had a chapter in Portland, and nationally it has gotten a pretty bad image, but basically it was a program that provided, for example, breakfast, a clinic, medical clinic, and also a legal clinic to help people out. And so this is another example of Blacks taking initiative in doing things to help other Blacks. More currently, Black Lives Matter protests are still going on in September of 2020 in Portland, Oregon, along with the pandemic and the fires. And Bend, Oregon is also one of the places. Now, there are very, very few people, Black people, living in Bend, and yet we have a demonstration like this in Bend. Why? Well, the population of Bend, I should have begun this by saying that the past is like a foreign country. People do things differently there, and the present is different from the past. So the population of Bend is not the same as the population of Bend when it started, and the attitude of people in Bend is not the same. In fact, the attitude of people in Oregon has changed because Oregon has changed significantly. There are now over 4 million people living here, and most of them were not born here. In the either the 2000 or the 2010 census, it was discovered that a majority of Oregonians were not born in Oregon. In fact, 10% of Oregonians were born in foreign countries, We have, for example, in Portland and Eugene and Salem and perhaps other towns as well, people who were born in the Philippines, in Ethiopia, in Nigeria, in Italy, who have come to Ben. And so that population change has changed the attitude of people so that we can see Black Lives Matter protests in Bend, Oregon in 2020. So it's been a long, long history. We need to focus, I believe, on the future and not on the past. And I asked you to think at the beginning, what did you know about the history of Blacks in Oregon? Well, this has been a very, very brief history. And I think it is incumbent on you to learn more, not only about Blacks, but other folks. In the 1940s, for example, when Blacks were coming to Portland to work in the shipyards, and whites were going off to war and Blacks were going off to war, that led to a vacuum, which was filled by people from Mexico coming up to work in the fields and so forth. As Oregon became more of an industrial state, then they needed different people as well. Currently, 24% of the population of Oregon consists of people of color. And that is going to continue to change. We're going to become more and more multicultural. And so we need to adjust to that, to learn about people. And so in conclusion, I would urge you to learn more about different people by reading, by engaging in activities like these lectures provided by the Deschutes County Public Library. Today, you and me are helping to shape Oregon's tomorrow. What will it look like? That's up to us. In the 1930s, Black poet Langston Hughes penned a very, very interesting poem. America never was America to me, but it ends, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. The story of Oregon in the 21st century is up to you. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you. Really, really interesting stuff. So I graduated from high school, grew up in Central Oregon, graduated from an Oregon high school, and had no idea about the origins of Oregon's Constitution, the founding of Oregon as a state that's where slavery was not allowed, but Black people weren't allowed here either. And I'm wondering, do you think this is becoming something that young people are learning more about, the origins of Oregon out in the history programs out in our country, in our state, in our schools? Do you think that's being taught more regularly now than it was?
I'm not sure if it is. When I taught in the public schools in Portland and at Portland Community College, I did, because I am a historian. I'm interested in the background of things. But there's now, I think last year or the year before, the State Department of Education initiated a policy where multicultural education will be required in all schools in Portland. And I think that it should be included. I don't know if it currently is, because some teachers are very, very tradition bound and don't see the necessity of making changes. But I think currently, and especially in light of the demographic changes in the US and in Oregon, that it needs to be something that is required. I think we need to know the beginnings, the origins, in order to better understand what's going on now, but also to understand that those were the origins. That is not necessarily what should control us now. We should be mindful of it. This is where we came from, but we're going to progress in a different direction, a direction that is more humane or more with a sense of our joint humanity.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's this learning to hold these two things at the same time. You know, this is our history and this is our future. And we don't, but pretending that didn't happen isn't necessarily productive either. It's a matter of coming to terms with it, a great reckoning of those events that will allow us to move forward together.
Yes, and I think part of the reason that people are reluctant is because they think that they may be blamed or held accountable for what people have done in the past. And that's why many historians use the phrase, the past is like a foreign country, because it is. People did things differently there. You're not to blame, I'm not to blame, but we need to be cognizant of that fact so that we know how to move on to a better future for the state of Oregon. It is going to change. In fact, there's one demographic that drove me to begin my class on race and racism, and that is by the 2040s or 2050s, there will be no majority ethnic group in the US. California is already there. There is no major majority ethnic group in California. The largest group are Latinos, followed by whites. Blacks make up about 7% of the population. And that's one other thing I failed to mention about where people came from. Places like Ohio, Indiana had laws, and Missouri had laws which were exclusionary laws or required Blacks who lived there to pay an annual poll tax in order to live there. A question that's often asked is, why are there so few Blacks in Oregon? Well, Blacks originate in West Africa, live mostly in the Southeast, and moved in Eastern US. Coming to the West, there are a few states that have a lot of Blacks. California, about 6%, Washington, about 4%, Oregon, between 2.5% and 3% now. But if you go to Idaho, less than 1%, Nevada, and so forth. So it's not a matter of why there's so few. As I pointed out, we missed the boat with quite a few people. And I've only mentioned a couple of them, like Sir James Douglas, Mr. Bogle, who had to go up to Walla Walla. And now things are beginning to change, and we have got to accept that change.
Thank you. Well, I really want to thank you, Professor Harrison, for spending this time with us here today. We really appreciate your scholarship and your willingness to share with us. So thanks very much. And thank you for joining us at Deschutes Public Library's online programming. If you'll check our calendar, our web calendar, there is a link to an online survey. If you want to fill that out for us and just let us know what kind of program you'd like to see us move towards, I'd really appreciate it. And also you can find links to all of our other outstanding library programs. Thanks for joining us.